Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Mr. Herring's fifth grade social studies class. Today we are going to be continuing our Unit 7, United States as a World Superpower, with the next lesson, the Roaring Twenties. This is a very profitable and prosperous time in American history, and today we're going to talk about the things that made it the Roaring Twenties. So some fun facts about the 1920s, some facts and figures. The Roaring Twenties are widespread economic and social change occurred. Great changes occurred in the 1920s, especially for the female population. Our population was about 121,767,000 people. A gallon of milk cost about 58 cents. The average yearly income for a family of four is about $1,574. Fashion of the time were short bob haircuts, very short hemlines for females, which had never been seen before. Hats became very popular. Knickers, and of course, the Lindbergh leather was very, very popular. Favorite sports of the time was tennis, and golf was becoming very popular. We had some crazes like the marathon dances, the Charleston, the flagpole sitting, King Tut, Ouija boards became popular, and of course, crossword puzzles hit the scene. Comic and cartoon characters exploded during this time. We get Felix the Cat, the most famous cartoon of all, probably Mickey Mouse, and then we also get Little Orphan Annie. Now, the games were probably some games you probably aren't familiar with. We had marbles. The statue game was really popular for kids. Jump rope is invented, and we get roller skating for the first time. New foods hit the scene. We get Welch's grape jelly, Eskimo pies, and one of my personal favorites, Wrigley's chewing gum. So let's start with the Roaring Twenties. You have your note page. You should be filling out your notes as we go. When you see a highlighted, bolded word, that is a word missing in your notes. And it's an important fact because you'll probably see it on an assessment. So why were the 1920s roaring? So think about this. When you hear the word roaring, what comes to mind when you hear that word roar? It's going to be different for everyone. For me personally, I think of a lion, right, making a big noise, a big scene, and that kind of epitomizes what the 1920s were. Lots of things explode onto the scene. They make a big change, a big splash, a big roar. The 1920s was a time period when America was roaring. Following the tragedies of World War I, we're just coming out of World War I in 1918, where we lost about 51,000 Americans. The United States took a turn for the better. The economy flourished and culture began changing. Americans saw a change in fashion, language, inventions, entertainment, and even more. By all stretches of the imagination, 1920s quite possibly could be the most prosperous time in American history. Today one of the big catchphrases in politics on one of the political sides is making America great again. And the 1920s, certainly America was very great for a large portion of our population. Not for everyone, of course. It's never been great for everyone, but for the vast majority of Americans, it was a really great time in our history, economically and culturally as well. One of the biggest changing cultures were for the women. Women went through extreme changes during the 1920s. Life for women in the 1920s became much less restrictive. The suffrage movement gave the women finally they had the right to vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment, of course. And more women began working outside of the home and taking roles that were formerly only held by men. We've talked about this in class where prior to the 1920s, women weren't really concerned with voting or concerned with things that were going on outside the home. Their role was in the home, taking care of the children, taking care of the home. And that was very well respected. It was a very difficult job and a well respected job for women. But in the late 1800s, we get a movement where women start to kind of explore what's going on outside the home. And the 1920s was definitely a time for women to roar, so to speak, and they go through significant changes. We have a lot of changing culture, especially for the African Americans, Black Americans in our country. African American culture made a huge important development during the 1920s. One of the biggest movements was called the Harlem Renaissance because this movement began in a New York neighborhood named Harlem. African American artists and athletes thrived and helped with the development of current artistic and music styles. We get the what will later come the jazz age with big entertainers like Louis Armstrong, which we'll talk about in a moment. But art really came out of this period for Black Americans as well. It was a huge style, and lots of people, not just Black Americans, but Americans from all walks of life, were adopting culture from this Harlem Renaissance movement. Children also had a change in their culture. We get comics and cartoon characters for the first time on a main scale, a large scale. Some familiar stories first took the form of children's books at this time, like Winnie the Pooh and Bambi and the Velveteen Rabbit became huge hits for children. These books were in every household and were read to children at night in almost every household. Mickey Mouse hits the scene for the first time, which exploded into the Disney enterprise we have today. This little picture here of Mickey Mouse was the very first cartoon with Mickey Mouse with Steamboat Willie. The Disney enterprise kind of begins in the 1920s um, with Walt starting his franchise. Very popular toys and games include paper dolls, Tinker Toys on the left over here. This picture was one of my favorite toys growing up. We also get marbles, teddy bears. We'll talk about Teddy a little bit later as well, where that teddy bear came from. Jump rope becomes really popular, and of course, the very popular for kids my age anyway, when I was young, roller skating. Now, fashion is probably where the biggest change occurs, especially for the women. Now, prior to the 20s, women were extremely conservative. They wore very long dresses, did not show much skin at all. Arms were covered, neckline was covered, just very conservative. But in the 20s, we see an extreme change. Women start to really venture out and explore and push limits and express themselves in ways never done before. The fashion followed along with the new freedoms they were granted with voting. Some women sported the rebellious flapper style. The flapper style is right here on the right, with very short hemlines, short skirts, tank tops or sleeveless blouses, a very deep neckline which showed exposed lots of the neck and parts of the chest. Flappers had very short hair, the short dresses that show their legs, and women wore makeup like outside the home, and this was very unheard of. Many of them smoked and hung out in jazz clubs, which would be extremely prohibited and looked down upon by a lot of the old-fashioned women. But it was very common to see these young ladies go to jazz clubs and really express themselves and have fun and dance with men, which was just outrageous at the time. Men's fashion also changed. It was influenced by the gangsters at the time period. They wore baggy suits, shiny shoes, and hats became very, very popular. We also get something called the zoot suit, which was a big, broad shoulders, very long jacket, almost down to the knees. A very interesting style in this time period. We get a number of inventions. Now, we don't get the mechanical inventions or like we did in the Industrial Revolution, but we get a very different type of inventions. These inventions were meant for convenience for people in our society. Very prosperous times for a community often bring about new inventions, of course, and some of the early inventions in the 1900s. We get Henry Ford's Model T car. During the 1920s, more common people began owning vehicles. In fact, it was Henry Ford's mission and goal in life to put a Model T in every house, in every garage. Zippers became a popular new invention for the fashion industry. For the first time, you could zip up a jacket, which previously we only had buttons. Other memorable inventions, we get Band-Aids, which is a brand, it's a bandage, a disposable bandage. We get disposable tissues, which we call Kleenex, which is another brand name, and chewing gum. there's a lot of rumors that are out there about Santa Ana and chewing gum and how he actually um, put people on the idea of chewing gum by carving bark out of a tree and chewing on it. And I don't really know if that's necessarily true, but we get chewing gum for the first time on a big scale in the 1920s. The entertainment changes, of course, with motion pictures, silent films. The radio was the most popular form of home entertainment. This took the place of modern day television. And, in those days, we didn't have televisions, they had radios. You could listen to programs on a radio. You listen to sporting events on the radio, baseball games on the radio, speeches from people on the radio. Families would sit in their homes and listen to popular episodes and music together. Movies also gained popularity in the 1920s. At that time, movies moved from silent to talkies. Charlie Chaplin was one of the most popular actors. He started out with silent films, and then he made popular some talkies as well. And of course, talkies being films with sound. We get music, like I mentioned earlier, the jazz age, the style of music changed greatly during the 1920s, and it earned the nickname of the jazz age. Many musicians, such as Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and King Oliver, still influence music to this day. The development of the blues style of music also began at this time, and has been influential in country music, western music, bluegrass music, even in pop and R&B music, you'll get that blues influence every once in a while. It has definitely withstood the test of time. Um, One of the strangest things that come out of the 1920s is prohibition. Prohibition now is very interesting because it was the politician's idea that alcohol was the root of all evil. So, one of the most memorable aspects of the 1920s was called Prohibition. In 1919, Congress passed the 18th Amendment. Now, this amendment made the making and selling of alcohol absolutely illegal. Now, we watched a movie earlier in this unit about the agitation with Miss Nations, Molly Nations, Carrie Nation, sorry, went on a rampage in the state of Kansas. Now we knew that alcohol was illegal in the state of Kansas, but there were still saloons, bars selling alcohol, even though it was illegal. And this kind of goes on across the country. Even though it's illegal, people still do it. Now, in big states where it's enforced more than others, it causes some really negative effects. So, what type of social problems might be fixed if there was no alcohol? The government was hoping that if we make illegal alcohol sales, that crime would go down and the quality of life would go up. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen because if you think about immigration in our country and where a lot of our immigrants come from, alcohol is a very big part of their culture. And so, for example, the Germans, which alcohol is a huge part of their culture, they come to our country and now they're not allowed to drink, and that's just not going to go over very well. Not to mention, Americans on their own really favor drinking and the use of alcohol. So, prohibition really is a bad thing for our country at that time. Because of prohibition, one of the worst effects is the gangster life, or what we call organized crime. People rebelled against this law and began making and selling their own alcohol illegally, like you hear of things called moonshine. Illegal bars called speakeasies popped up all over the country. Gangsters became alcohol smugglers and sold alcohol to illegal speakeasies. Speakeasy was like an underground club nobody knew about. You had to have a secret knock to get in. One of the most famous gangsters of the day was Al Capone. Mr. Capone became incredibly wealthy from his illegal business, and his gang was one of the most violent gangs in our history, and he controlled large areas and even people in the Chicago area. Of course, he did go to prison. Unfortunately, he didn't go to prison for the crimes he committed. He went to prison for tax evasion because he didn't pay taxes. And that's the only way the government could get him and arrest him and convict him. Also, prohibition, because it was just not working out, it comes to an end in 1933 with the 21st Amendment. Now, this sounds kind of funny. We passed another amendment to fix an amendment. So the prohibition ended in 1933, the 21st Amendment, and alcohol again became um, probably one of the most um, profitable businesses in our country's history. If you think about the government's goal with prohibition, was it really reached? And you think about that for a second. Did prohibition really work? And if you think about that, most people would probably say no, it didn't work. It kind of started some things that we wish we never really had. We have a lot of important people that come out of the Roaring Twenties. We get Amelia Earhart. She was the first female pilot to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. She later disappeared without a trace while attempting to fly around the world, of course. We get Babe Ruth. He's one of the most famous baseball players of all time. Of course, he set records for home runs and is a member of the Baseball Hall of Fame. We know his record was broken finally by um, Barry Bonds, and others broke it before Barry. Um, but these are two of the first big important people. We also get Bessie Smith. She was a blues singer. Her accomplishments were high for an African American entertainer at the time. Bessie made $2,000 a week at her height and recorded many albums. Louis Armstrong was another important musician. He was a leader in the jazz movement and is known for his scat singing. This means he sang nonsense sounds in the place of words to simulate instruments, which is really interesting. Very popular. We get Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald was an important author. He wrote something called the Saturday Evening Post and many of his own novels. Herbert Hoover, of course, was the president of the United States at the end of the 1920s. Initially, Hoover's presidency shared the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties, but when the stock market crashed, Hoover was not prepared to deal with the complicated situation, and he kind of gets blamed for all the negative things that happened after the Roaring Twenties. And it really wasn't his fault. He just didn't do much to stop it or really even help it. And of course, the 1920s come to a screeching halt on Tuesday, October 24th, 1921. This day is called Black Tuesday. The stock market just could not support itself anymore and it crashed, and the wealth of many Americans was lost. The time period following this event becomes known as the Great Depression. This period was extremely difficult financially, and many people lost their jobs, their food, their homes, and all of their wealth. And it becomes a really, really bad time in our country's history. Of course, we have a man that will come along a little bit later by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who will bail us out of the Great Depression with something called the New Deal. So that is the Roaring Twenties in a nutshell. What I'd like for you to do now is to pause the video, and I would like for you to answer these 10 questions using the notes that you just used. Number one, why did the 1920s gain the nickname the Roaring Twenties? Number two, what law change gave women greater rights and freedoms? That's an amendment. Number three, what was the movement that led to the development of African American art styles? Number four, describe to me what the flapper style was. Why was this style such a big deal? Number five, name at least three inventions from the 1920s. It could be anything. Number six, what piece of equipment provided entertainment for the 1920s families in their homes? Number seven, name the new styles of music and the nickname this gave the time period. Number eight, what was the goal of the Prohibition movement and how did this movement backfire? Number nine, name at least four important people from the 1920s and their accomplishments. And finally, number 10, what major event signaled the end of the Roaring Twenties? So pause the video and go ahead and answer these 10 questions using your notes. Nothing to write down, just make sure you can answer them using your notes. And then when you're done, I hope you have a wonderful day and I will see you next time, guys. Have a good evening.